picture this for a second. We've got this 16-year-old kid, right? Bright, athletic, the kind of kid everyone just knows is going somewhere. Good family, supportive, the whole 9 yards. And then, one night, at a party, they decide, hey, why not? They take a pill. Doesn't seem like a big deal. Everyone else is doing it, right? But then, fast forward a couple years, maybe even less, and that same kid, full of potential, is living on the streets, stealing to get their fix, maybe even from their own family. Terrifyingly close to an overdose.
And it's that fast sometimes. It really is.
That's the thing about drug addiction that's just so hard to grasp. It doesn't care who you are, where you come from, or what you could have been. It just takes hold. And that's why, honestly, that's why we're doing this whole deep dive today, because we need to confront this crisis that just seems to be getting worse and worse. We want to really unpack this for you, this whole hidden epidemic of drug addiction.
Absolutely. We can't let this just be another news story, another statistic. These are real lives, real families being torn apart. We need to go beyond the surface here, beyond just the headlines and the numbers. We're going to look at some real stories, of course, summarized, to protect people's privacy. We'll bring in the expertise, the science, and most importantly, I think we want to look at solutions. What actually works? Because our goal today is to break down those myths, those walls of stigma that we've built up around addiction.
It's that stigma, I think, that keeps us from actually dealing with this problem, Keeps people from getting help. So we're going to ask the hard questions today. Is addiction a choice? Or is it something more like a disease? How do these substances, these drugs, actually change how our brains work? And what are those things, those hidden triggers that can set someone on this path, Trauma, friends, maybe mental health issues. And for you out there listening, the biggest question probably, is recovery even possible? And if it is, what works? What treatments actually help? And I guess finally, what can we do? What can families, friends, society as a whole do to be part of the solution?
Those are the key questions. Absolutely.
So let's start at the beginning. What is addiction, really?
Well, the first thing to get straight, right off the bat, is that addiction isn't about making bad choices. Science tells us that addiction is actually a chronic brain disorder. Think about it like other long-term illnesses, like diabetes, heart disease. It's a condition. It's about this compulsive seeking and using of drugs or alcohol, even when it's causing serious harm. It's not a slip-up here and there. This is a real struggle.
So not just a lack of willpower, then?
Exactly. Not even close. And this is where it gets really interesting. A lot of the drugs that people get addicted to, they target the brain's reward system. This system is all about dopamine. It's a brain chemical, a neurotransmitter. And dopamine gets released when we experience pleasure. You eat something delicious, you spend time with loved ones, boom, dopamine. And that makes us want to do those things again. But drugs kind of hack this system. They flood the brain with dopamine, creating this super intense pleasure, that high.
So it's like they amplify our natural reward system artificially.
Right. But here's the thing. With repeated use, the brain adapts. It gets less sensitive to the dopamine. That means you need more of the drug to get that same high. We call that tolerance. And then it gets worse. The brain's reward system gets so wired to the drug that normal pleasures, they just don't compare anymore. The drug becomes the only thing that matters, the only way to get that reward. The fun turns into a desperate need.
Wow. So the brain is actually changing physically.
Literally rewiring itself. Brain scans, PET scans, MRIs, they show actual structural and functional changes in the brains of people with addiction. It's not just the reward system either. It's the parts of the brain that control decision-making, impulse control, emotions. And that's a big reason why quitting is so hard. The brain's been reprogrammed.
And then there are the withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, that doesn't help. When someone stops using, the brain freaks out. It's trying to readjust to get back to normal. And that causes withdrawal, nausea, muscle aches, anxiety, depression, sometimes even psychosis. Depends on the drug. But what really gets people, even after the physical stuff subsides, are the cravings. Those can last for months, years even, because of those deep changes in the brain we talked about.
So it's like a double whammy. You've got the physical withdrawal and then this constant nagging craving. No wonder it's so hard to break free. Now, we talked about different categories of drugs. Can we break down how these different types affect people?
Absolutely. Let's start with stimulants, things like cocaine and methamphetamine. They rev up the central nervous system. Someone using a stimulant, they feel euphoric, energetic, super alert. But then comes the crash. Fatigue, depression, and those intense cravings to use again. Meth, especially, can really wreck the brain and the body over time.
And then you've got depressants like alcohol and Xanax.
Right. Depressants, they slow down brain activity. Alcohol, it's everywhere, socially accepted. But make no mistake, it's addictive. And it can cause serious health problems for people who use it heavily over time. Benzodiazepines, like Xanax, they're usually prescribed for anxiety, but those can be addictive too, and fast. The biggest danger with depressants, though, is overdose, especially if they're mixed with other depressants like opioids. They can suppress breathing to a really dangerous level.
Which brings us to opioids, heroin, fentanyl, prescription painkillers. This seems to be the epicenter of a lot of the addiction crisis we're seeing.
What's both fascinating and tragic about opioids is that they work by binding to these receptors in the brain that reduce pain, and they create this intense euphoria. That's why doctors prescribe them for pain. But they're so addictive, and the body quickly builds up tolerance, so you need higher and higher doses to get the same effect. And that's what makes overdoses so likely, especially with fentanyl. It's incredibly potent. Just a tiny amount can be fatal.
And then you've got hallucinogens, LSD, psychedelic mushrooms. Those seem to affect people differently.
Yeah, hallucinogens are in their own category. They mess with perception, thoughts, mood. They can cause hallucinations, make you see and hear things that aren't real. Now, they may not be physically addictive in the same way as some other drugs, but they do come with psychological risks, bad trips, flashbacks, and they can actually make existing mental health problems worse, even if the person doesn't realize they have them.
It's sobering, really, to hear about all the different effects, the dangers. Earlier, we talked about some of those myths about addiction. Let's dig into that a bit more. One we hear all the time is only weak people get addicted.
Yeah, that was just plain wrong and harmful. It makes people feel ashamed, like it's their fault, and that stops them from getting help. Addiction, as we've seen, is a brain disorder. It's not about willpower. There are all these factors at play, things people can't control, like genetics. If your family has a history of addiction, your risk goes up. And the environment matters too. Early exposure to drugs, a lot of stress, those things increase the risk.
So it's not about being weak, it's about biology, environment, whole bunch of things. Another one we hear is you have to hit rock bottom to recover.
Ugh, that one's so dangerous.
Mm.
It makes people think they have to lose everything before they can get help. And that's just not true. While some people do reach a crisis point, it doesn't have to be that way. Waiting for rock bottom can have terrible consequences. Early intervention, that's the key. The sooner someone realizes there's a problem, the better their chances of getting better. It can prevent so much pain, so much damage.
So forget rock bottom, get help early. It's clear that these myths just get in the way of understanding addiction and getting people the help they need. We've looked at what addiction is, busted some myths. Now let's talk about why it happens. What are the root causes?
Well, this is where it gets complicated. There's no single answer. For you to really get this, we have to look at the whole picture. Biology, psychology, and the environment, all of it.
Okay, let's start with the biological factors. We talked about genetics. How much does that matter?
Genetics are definitely a big part of the puzzle. Studies show that people with a family history of addiction, they're at a higher risk themselves. Now, there's no one addiction gene. It's more about variations in genes that affect how your brain reacts to drugs, how fast you build up tolerance, how bad withdrawal is, and then there's brain chemistry. If someone naturally has low levels of dopamine, for example, they might be more likely to seek out drugs that give them that dopamine rush we talked about.
Makes sense. Not a guarantee, but definitely a predisposition. What about psychological triggers? That seems like a huge piece of this.
Absolutely. Trauma, especially childhood trauma, is a major risk factor for addiction. There's this big study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACE study. They looked at the long-term health effects of different types of childhood trauma. Abuse, neglect, things like that. And the results were clear. The more trauma someone experiences as a child, the more likely they are to develop addiction as an adult.
Trauma leaves scars.
It does, deep ones. And for some people, drugs and alcohol, they become a way to cope, to numb the pain, to self-medicate.
That self-medication aspect, that ties into mental health disorders, doesn't it?
Big time. There's a huge overlap between mental health issues like depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. People with these conditions, they often turn to drugs or alcohol to try to feel better, to relieve their symptoms. Someone with social anxiety might drink to feel more relaxed in social situations. Someone with depression might use stimulants for a temporary energy boost. But here's the problem. That self-medication, it actually makes the mental health problem worse in the long run.
So it's not always about wanting to get high. Sometimes it's about trying to escape pain. Now let's look at those social and environmental influences. Peer pressure is a big one, right? Especially for young people.
Oh yeah, especially teenagers, young adults, wanting to fit in, be part of the group, that's powerful. And it can lead to trying drugs for the first time, even if you don't really want to. That just try it once, pressure, can be hard to resist, and for some people, that one time can be the start of a really bad road.
And socioeconomic factors play a role too, right?
Oh, sure. Poverty, lack of education, unemployment, feeling hopeless about the future, all of that creates an environment where drug use is more common. People are trying to cope to escape their reality.
And then there's the way we see drug use in the media. Does that have an effect?
It's hard to measure the exact impact, but the way some media glamorizes drug use, it can definitely make it seem cool, rebellious, normal even. Think about the whole rock star drug culture. That can desensitize people, especially young people, to the risks.
So we've got biology, psychology, environment, all these factors coming together. I think it's helpful to look at a specific example to see how this plays out in the real world. Let's talk about the opioid epidemic. How did we get here?
The opioid epidemic, it's a perfect storm of different factors. One of the biggest was the overprescribing of opioid painkillers. Started in the late 90s, early 2000s. Pharmaceutical companies, they were pushing these drugs hard, telling doctors they were safe, effective for chronic pain, but they downplayed the addiction risk big time. So doctors started prescribing opioids like crazy.
So people are getting these highly addictive drugs from their own doctors.
Exactly. And as more and more people got exposed to these medications, addiction rates started to climb. And then when regulations got tighter, when it became harder to get prescription opioids, people turned to heroin. It's chemically similar to a lot of prescription opioids, and it was cheaper, easier to get. And then came fentanyl, way more potent than heroin, incredibly dangerous. That's been driving the huge increase in overdose deaths we're seeing now.
And you mentioned Big Pharma. What role did they play in this?
Well, there's been a lot of scrutiny on the pharmaceutical industry, a lot of lawsuits even. They're accused of misleading doctors, the public, about the risks of these drugs. And they pushed them for all sorts of pain, maybe more than was appropriate. So opioids were everywhere, seen as safe, and that played a huge role in creating this crisis we're still dealing with today.
It's a really complex problem, all these different levels, individual, societal, even corporate. Now, to bring this home for you listening, I think it's important to hear some real-life stories, summarized, of course, to protect privacy, but real stories about how addiction affects people's lives.
Stories are what make this real, you know? Let's take an example. Imagine this, an honor student, straight A's, involved in everything, loving family, the perfect picture. But then, maybe experimenting with friends, they try heroin, and it takes hold fast. It can happen that quickly. They start using more and more, needing it just to feel okay to get through the day. Grades plummet, they withdraw from everyone, and things spiral. Overdose, legal trouble, family falling apart. It's a nightmare. But here's the thing. Even in that story, there can be hope. Maybe that overdose is a wake-up call. Maybe the family steps in and gets them help. It's a long road recovery, but it is possible.
It really can happen to anyone. What about the families? How does this affect them?
Oh, families go through so much. The emotional toll, the practical challenges, it's immense. Imagine a parent whose kid starts using marijuana. Maybe they think, it's just weed, not a big deal. But for some people, it's a gateway to other drugs. Or they get addicted to marijuana itself. The parent starts to notice things. The kid's secretive, grades are slipping, they've got new friends. And as the addiction progresses, it just weighs on the whole family. Fear, anger, guilt, financial stress. It can tear a family apart if they don't get the right support.
Sounds incredibly isolating, painful. So families are victims too, in a way. They need help as much as the person struggling with addiction. Now, the big question, solutions, treatment. Is recovery even possible?
Yes, recovery is absolutely possible. It happens every day. It's a journey. It looks different for everyone. But with the right support, the right treatment, people can and do get their lives back.
What are some of the medical treatments out there? We hear about detox, rehab.
Right. Medically, it often starts with detoxification, detox. It's basically a medically supervised process to help manage the withdrawal symptoms as the body gets rid of the drug. But, and this is important, detox alone usually isn't enough for long-term recovery. It addresses the physical dependence, but not the underlying psychological and behavioral stuff. That's where rehab comes in. Rehab programs, they provide this structured environment, support, therapy, counseling. People learn coping skills, the tools they need to stay sober long-term.
What about medication-assisted treatment, Matt? We're hearing more and more about that.
MAT is a game changer. It's using FDA-approved medications along with counseling and therapy. For opioid addiction, medications like methadone and Suboxone can be super effective. They help reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms so people can actually focus on therapy and rebuilding their lives. There are meds for alcohol dependence too. MAT has been shown to really improve outcomes, reduce relapse, prevent overdose. It's a key part of the solution.
So medication can help, but what about therapy, counseling?
Therapy is crucial. It's essential. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, it's a big one. It helps people identify and change the negative thoughts and behaviors that are linked to their drug use, gives them coping mechanisms, strategies to deal with cravings and triggers. And group therapy like AA, NA, that provides a community. People can share their experiences, support each other, realizing you're not alone. That can be so powerful.
It sounds like you need a whole toolkit, different approaches working together. What about those more holistic approaches? Are those helpful?
Absolutely. We're realizing more and more that we need to treat the whole person. That means exercise. It improves mood, reduces stress. Nutrition is important too because
Yeah.
drug abuse can really mess up your diet. And mindfulness practices like meditation, yoga, they can help people manage cravings, become more self-aware. And for a lot of people, faith and spirituality are a big part of recovery. Gives them a sense of purpose, meaning. These holistic things, they work alongside the medical and therapeutic stuff to support overall well-being.
This is all great info for anyone who wants to understand addiction and recovery better. But what about families? How can they help a loved one who's struggling?
That's tough. Families need to understand the importance of setting boundaries, healthy boundaries. This isn't about abandoning someone. It's about protecting yourself and not enabling the addiction. Sometimes it takes tough love. Saying no to giving money that might be used for drugs, letting the person experience the consequences of their actions. But it's a delicate balance. It's got to be combined with love, support, letting a person know that you're there for them, that you believe in their recovery whenever they're ready. And families need to avoid enabling behaviors, things like making excuses, bailing them out of trouble, covering for them. That might seem helpful in the moment, but it prevents the person from hitting that point where they realize they need to change.
So, support recovery, but don't support the addiction itself. Makes sense. Last thing, prevention. What can we do as a society to prevent addiction from happening in the first place?
Prevention, that's where it all starts. We need good drug education in schools, accurate, age-appropriate information about the risks, the consequences. And it can't just be drugs are bad. We have to teach kids how addiction works, how it affects the brain, the body.
It's got to be real.
Real. And we need policy changes, tighter regulations on drugs, more support for harm reduction programs like needle exchanges, and we need more funding for treatment. We also need to address those social and economic factors that contribute to addiction. Poverty, lack of opportunity, all of that. It's a complex problem, but we can make a difference.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Before we go, what's your final message for our listeners?
If you're listening to this and you're struggling, please hear me. You are not alone, and recovery is possible. There are people who care, and there's help available. Don't wait, reach out. A good first step is the SAMHSA National Helpline, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Their number is easy to find online. And look for local resources too. Rehab centers, support groups. It's a hard step to take, but it can change your life.
And we want to leave you with this thought. We need to change how we think about addiction. It's not a moral failing, it's not weakness, it's a health crisis. And it needs our understanding, our compassion, and our action. If we can break down the stigma, if you can educate ourselves and support each other, we can create a world where recovery is possible for everyone.